The 1970s were supposed to be the golden age of American muscle cars. Raw power, screaming engines, and zero compromises. But what automakers created were beautiful monsters that could kill you in spectacular fashion. From engines that literally exploded to suspensions that couldn't handle their own power, these 15 muscle cars defined an era where horsepower mattered more than survival. Buckle up, because we're about to discover the most powerful and most dangerous muscle cars ever to terrorize America's streets. 1970, Buick GSX Stage 1. Buick wanted to prove they could build muscle cars, too. So they took their Grand Sport and injected it with steroids, creating the GSX Stage 1. With 360 horsepower from a 455 cubic inch V8, this thing was a rocket ship disguised as a luxury car. But Buick forgot one crucial detail: how to make it stop. The GSX Stage 1 could hit 60 miles per hour in 5.5 seconds, which was mind-blowing for 1970. But the brakes were borrowed from a regular Skylark, because apparently Buick thought physics was optional. Drivers quickly discovered that panic stops were adventures in terror. The front disc brakes would fade after one hard stop, leaving you with rear drums that were designed for grocery shopping, not stopping 4,000 pounds of angry Detroit steel. The suspension was another nightmare. Buick engineers seemed to think that making it stiffer would solve everything. Wrong. The GSX Stage 1 would hop and skip over bumps like a kangaroo on speed, hit a pothole at speed, and the rear end would literally bounce off the ground. One road test described it as trying to control a bucking bronco that's also a missile. Insurance companies took notice fast. By 1971, premiums were so high that most buyers couldn't afford to insure them. Buick quietly discontinued the Stage 1 option, citing emissions regulations. The real reason? Too many wealthy customers were discovering that luxury and lethality make a bad combination. Today, surviving GSX Stage 1s are worth six figures to collectors who apparently enjoy living on the edge. The car proved that Buick could build muscle cars just as dangerous as anyone else. Sometimes that's not a good thing. 1970, Oldsmobile 442 W30. Oldsmobile's 442 was supposed to be the gentleman's muscle car. Refined, powerful, civilized. Then they created the W30 option and threw civilization out the window. This wasn't just a muscle car. It was a barely controlled explosion on wheels. The W30 package turned the already potent 442 into a 370 horsepower monster. But here's where Oldsmobile's engineers went completely insane. They gave it a fiberglass hood with functional air scoops that created a wind tunnel effect at speed. Above 70 miles per hour, the hood would literally try to rip itself off the car. Drivers reported that the hood would flex and bow like it was breathing. The real terror came from the suspension setup. Oldsmobile used heavy-duty everything: springs, shocks, sway bars. The result was a car that rode like a medieval torture device. Every bump was transmitted directly to your spine. But worse, the stiff suspension meant the car would suddenly lose grip without warning. One moment you're cruising, the next you're sliding sideways into oncoming traffic. The W30's party trick was something called axle tramp. Under hard acceleration, the rear axle would literally hop up and down, causing the entire car to shake violently. It looked like the car was having a seizure. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The hopping would break traction randomly, sending the car into unpredictable slides. Oldsmobile claimed the W30 was their ultimate performance package. What they created was a car that could hit 60 miles per hour in 5.7 seconds, but couldn't be driven safely by anyone without a death wish. The W30 proved that sometimes the difference between thrilling and terrifying is just a matter of perspective. 1970. Plymouth Cuda AAR. Plymouth looked at the Trans Am Racing Series and decided they needed a street car that could dominate the track. The result was the Cuda AAR, a car so focused on performance that safety became an afterthought. With its 340 cubic inch six-pack engine and race-inspired suspension, it was supposed to be Plymouth's ultimate weapon. The AAR's engine was the star of the show. 3 two-barrel carburetors fed the 340 V8, creating a sound that could wake the dead. But here's the problem. The engine was tuned for racing, not street driving. It needed high-octane fuel to run properly, and when it didn't get it, the engine would knock itself to death. Literally, the pistons would melt, the rings would fail, and the engine would seize without warning. The suspension was borrowed directly from the race car, which sounds impressive until you realize race cars don't need to handle potholes, speed bumps, or normal roads. The AAR's suspension was so stiff that hitting a manhole cover would launch you into the air. The car would bounce and skip over imperfections like a flat stone on water. But the real danger was the rear end. The AAR came with a Dana 60 rear axle that was virtually indestructible. The problem wasn't the axle. It was how it was mounted. Under hard acceleration, the axle would twist so violently that it would rip the mounting points right out of the unibody. Owners would find their rear ends literally separating from their cars. Plymouth only made 2,724 AAR Cudas, partly because demand was low and partly because warranty claims were astronomical. The car was so specialized that most buyers couldn't live with it. It was a race car that you could license for the street, but probably shouldn't. 1971. Plymouth Hemi Cuda. The 1971 Hemi Cuda was Plymouth's final answer to the muscle car wars. With 425 horsepower from the legendary 426 Hemi engine, it was the most powerful production car Plymouth had ever built. It was also one of the most dangerous, because all that power came with 0 electronic aids and a suspension that belonged in a museum. The Hemi engine was a race motor that happened to be street legal. It made massive power, but only if you could keep it running. The engine required constant attention, premium fuel, frequent tune-ups, and prayers to the automotive gods. Get the mixture wrong, and the engine would backfire so violently that it would blow the intake manifold apart. One owner reported that his Cuda's backfire was so loud that it set off car alarms 3 blocks away. The real terror was the torque. The Hemi made 490 foot-pounds of torque, which was enough to twist the unibody into a pretzel. Hard acceleration would cause the entire car to flex like a noodle. The doors would jam, the windows would bind, and the trunk would pop open. It was like driving a car made of rubber. The suspension couldn't handle the power either. The front end would lift so high under acceleration that you'd lose steering. The rear end would squat so low that the exhaust pipes would scrape the ground. And if you hit a bump while accelerating, the car would literally bounce sideways. Insurance companies quickly figured out that Hemi Cudas were death traps. By 1972, premiums were so high that most buyers couldn't afford them. Plymouth sold fewer than 1,000 Hemi Cudas in 1971, making it one of the rarest muscle cars ever built. There's a reason for that rarity. Most buyers were smart enough to stay away. 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS454 LS6. Chevrolet's 1970 Chevelle SS454 LS6 was supposed to be the ultimate muscle car. With 450 horsepower from the legendary LS6 engine, it was the most powerful production car GM had ever built. It was also a perfect example of what happens when you put a nuclear engine in a car with the safety features of a shopping cart. The LS6 engine was pure violence. It made so much power that Chevrolet had to use a special cowl induction hood just to get enough air into the engine. But here's the terrifying part. All that power was controlled by a 4-speed manual transmission with a clutch that was essentially an on-off switch. There was no gradual engagement, no forgiveness. You either had all the power or none of it. The chassis couldn't handle the abuse. The frame would flex so much under hard acceleration that the car would literally change shape. Body panels would misalign, gaps would open up, and the car would creak and groan like it was in pain. One automotive journalist described it as driving a car that's actively trying to tear itself apart. The suspension was a joke. Chevrolet used the same basic setup as a grocery getter Malibu, just with stiffer springs. The result was a car that could launch like a rocket, but couldn't handle a corner without trying to kill you. The rear end would swing out without warning, the front end would push wide, and the whole car would feel like it was skating on ice. Chevrolet only made the LS6 for 1 year, claiming emissions regulations killed it. The truth was simpler. They had created a car so powerful and so dangerous that even they were afraid of it. Today, surviving LS6 Chevelle are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to collectors who clearly have more money than sense. 1970. Dodge Challenger RT 446 pack. Dodge's entry into the pony car wars was the Challenger, and they made sure it went out with a bang. The RT 446 pack was their ultimate weapon. 3 two-barrel carburetors feeding a 440 cubic inch V8 that made 375 horsepower. It looked fantastic and sounded even better. Too bad it was trying to kill you. The six-pack system was engineering madness. 3 carburetors meant 3 times the complexity, 3 times the maintenance, and 3 times the ways it could go wrong. The center carburetor handled idle and cruise, while the outer 2 kicked in under heavy throttle. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a nightmare. The carburetors would go out of sync, causing the engine to stumble, backfire, and occasionally catch fire. The real danger was the power delivery. When all 3 carburetors opened up, the engine would unleash a torrent of power that would overwhelm the chassis. The Challenger's unibody construction wasn't designed for this abuse. Hard acceleration would cause the entire car to flex like a wet noodle. The doors would jam, the windows would bind, and sometimes the rear window would crack from the body flex. The suspension was borrowed from the cheaper Barracuda, which was fine for a normal car, but completely inadequate for a 446 pack. The rear end would hop and skip under power, breaking traction randomly. The front end would lift so high that steering became a suggestion rather than a command. One owner described it as trying to steer a rocket ship with a wet rope. Dodge only made the 446 pack for 2 years before emissions regulations killed it. But the real reason was warranty claims. Too many owners were discovering that their beautiful muscle car was also a beautiful disaster. 1971. Plymouth Roadrunner 440+6. Plymouth's Roadrunner was supposed to be the everyman's muscle car. Cheap, fast, and simple. Then they created the 440+6 option and threw simplicity out the window. This wasn't just a muscle car. It was a barely controlled explosion that happened to have 4 wheels. The 440+6 engine was Plymouth's answer to Chevrolet's big block domination. 3 two-barrel carburetors fed a 440 cubic inch V8 that officially made 385 horsepower. But dyno tests revealed the truth. It was making closer to 450 horsepower. Plymouth had underrated it to keep insurance companies happy and EPA regulators at bay. The problem was the chassis. The Roadrunner's unibody was designed for Plymouth's economy cars, not for engines that could tear concrete in half. Under hard acceleration, the entire car would twist like a pretzel. The rear axle would literally try to rip itself out of the car. One owner reported that his Roadrunner's rear window shattered during a hard launch because the body flexed so much. The suspension was another nightmare. Plymouth used heavy-duty rear springs that were so stiff they felt like they were made of concrete. Every bump was transmitted directly to your spine. But worse, the stiff rear springs meant the car would suddenly lose grip without warning. The rear end would step out during normal driving, sending you sliding into whatever was nearby. The 440+6 party trick was something called carburetor sync. When all three carburetors opened simultaneously, the engine would produce a sound that could be heard from miles away. It was like a primal scream from the automotive gods. But if the carburetors weren't perfectly synchronized, the engine would stumble and backfire with enough force to blow the air cleaner apart. Plymouth discontinued the 440+6 after just 2 years, claiming emissions killed it. The real reason was that they had created a car so violent that even they were afraid of it. 1970. Pontiac GTO Judge 455. Icho Pontiac's GTO had started the muscle car craze, so they decided to end it with a bang. The Judge 455HO was their ultimate statement. 370 horsepower from a 455 cubic inch V8, wrapped in psychedelic paint and enough attitude to start a riot. It was also dangerous enough to finish one. The 455HO engine was Pontiac's nuclear option. It made massive torque from idle to redline, which sounds great until you realize that the chassis couldn't handle it. The GTO's A-body platform was designed for family sedans, not for engines that could launch satellites. Under hard acceleration, the entire car would flex so much that body panels would misalign and gaps would open up between parts. The real terror was the weight transfer. The Judge was nose-heavy to begin with, and when you hit the gas, all that weight would shift to the rear. The front end would lift so high that you'd lose steering input. Meanwhile, the rear end would squat so low that the exhaust pipes would drag on the ground. It was like driving a seesaw at 100 miles per hour. Pontiac's engineers had tried to compensate with stiffer suspension components, but they just made things worse. The Judge rode like a medieval torture device. Every bump was transmitted directly to your kidneys. But the stiff suspension also meant the car would suddenly lose grip without warning. The rear end would step out during normal driving, sending you sliding into whatever was nearby. The Judge's distinctive graphics package included loud paint and racing stripes that made it impossible to hide from the police. Combined with the car's tendency to break traction at the slightest provocation, it was like driving around with a target on your back. Insurance companies quickly figured this out and started charging rates that made the car unaffordable for most buyers. Pontiac only made the Judge for 3 years before quietly discontinuing it. They claimed changing market conditions killed it, but the truth was simpler. They had created a car so antisocial that even they were embarrassed by it. 1970. Buick Skylark Grand Sport 455. Buick wanted to prove they could build muscle cars that were both powerful and refined. The Skylark Grand Sport 455 was their attempt to create a gentleman's hot rod. What they actually created was a car that could kill you with sophistication. The 455 cubic inch V8 made 350 horsepower, which was respectable for the era. But Buick had tuned it for low-end torque, which meant it hit like a freight train from idle. The problem was that all that torque was delivered through a chassis that was designed for cruising, not for racing. The Grand Sport suspension was soft and compliant, which felt nice until you tried to use the power. Under hard acceleration, the Grand Sport would squat so low in the rear that the bumper would almost touch the ground. The front end would lift so high that you'd lose all steering feel. And because the suspension was so soft, the car would continue to bounce and wallow long after you'd lifted off the throttle. It was like driving a boat in a storm. The real danger was the brakes. Buick had equipped the Grand Sport with four-wheel drum brakes that were fine for stopping a normal car, but completely inadequate for a muscle car. The brakes would fade after one hard stop, leaving you with nothing but hope and prayer. One road test described the braking as optimistic at best, suicidal at worst. Buick's engineers had also made the mistake of using a soft suspension tune with performance tires. The result was a car that would grip suddenly and then let go without warning. The rear end would step out during normal cornering, sending you sliding into whatever was nearby. It was like driving on black ice, except the ice was everywhere. The Grand Sport 455 proved that refinement and raw power don't mix. Buick had created a car that was simultaneously too soft and too violent, too civilized and too dangerous. It was a contradiction wrapped in chrome and covered in comfortable upholstery. 1971 Dodge Charger RT 440 Magnum. Dodge's Charger had been dominating NASCAR and terrorizing the streets since 1968. By 1971, they decided to make it even more dangerous with the RT 440 Magnum package. This wasn't just a muscle car. It was a guided missile that happened to have a license plate. The 440 Magnum engine was Dodge's big block masterpiece. It made 375 horsepower and 480 foot-pounds of torque, which was enough to twist the Charger's unibody into abstract art. The engine was so powerful that Dodge had to use a special intake manifold and a high-rise air cleaner just to contain the violence. But containment was a relative term. The real terror was the aerodynamics. The Charger's sleek body was designed for NASCAR, where downforce wasn't a concern. On the street, the car would literally try to take off at high speeds. Above 90 miles per hour, the front end would get so light that steering became a suggestion rather than a command. The car would wander across lanes like it was drunk. The suspension was another nightmare. Dodge had tuned it for oval track racing, which meant it was perfect for making left turns at 150 miles per hour, but terrible for everything else. The car would understeer horribly in right-hand turns, pushing wide no matter what you did. But in left-hand turns, it would suddenly oversteer, snapping the rear end around without warning. The Charger's party trick was something called aerodynamic lift. At highway speeds, the car would actually start to fly. The front end would get so light that hitting a bump would launch you into the air. One owner reported that his Charger became airborne while passing a semi-truck on the highway. He landed in the opposite lane, somehow avoiding a head-on collision. Dodge quietly discontinued the 440 Magnum after 1971, claiming emissions regulations killed it. The real reason was that they had created a car so aerodynamically unstable that it was basically a low-flying aircraft with wheels. 1970 Mercury Cougar Eliminator 428 Super Cobra jet. Mercury wanted to prove they could build muscle cars that were both sophisticated and savage. The Cougar Eliminator 428 Super Cobra jet was their ultimate weapon, a luxury pony car with the heart of a race car. It was also a perfect example of what happens when you put a nuclear engine in a chassis made of wishful thinking. The 428 Super Cobra jet engine was Ford's secret weapon. Officially rated at 335 horsepower, it was actually making closer to 400. Ford had underrated it to keep insurance companies and EPA regulators happy. But the engine's true nature was revealed the moment you hit the gas. It would launch the Cougar like a rocket ship, overwhelming the chassis and terrifying the driver. The real problem was the weight distribution. The Cougar was already nose-heavy, and the massive 428 engine made it worse. Under hard acceleration, all that weight would shift to the rear, lifting the front end so high that you'd lose steering. The car would wander across lanes like it was drunk, completely uncontrollable. Mercury's engineers had tried to compensate with heavy-duty suspension components, but they just made things worse. The Eliminator rode like a race car, transmitting every bump directly to your spine. But the stiff suspension also meant the car would suddenly lose grip without warning. The rear end would step out during normal driving, sending you sliding into whatever was nearby. The Eliminator's party trick was something called instant oversteer. The moment you lifted off the throttle in a corner, the rear end would snap around like a whip. There was no gradual breakaway, no warning. 1 second you were cruising, the next you were sliding backwards into oncoming traffic. Mercury only made the Eliminator for 2 years before quietly discontinuing it. They claimed changing market conditions killed it, but the truth was simpler. They had created a car so violent that even they were afraid of it. 1970 Dodge Challenger TA346 pack. Dodge's Challenger TA was supposed to be their answer to the Mustang Boss 302 and Camaro Z/28. It was designed for Trans Am racing, which meant it was built for maximum performance with minimum regard for safety. The result was a car that could embarrass supercars, but would probably kill you in the process. The 346-pack engine was a jewel of engineering. 3 two-barrel carburetors fed a high-revving 340 cubic inch V8 that made 290 horsepower. But that was just the beginning. The engine was tuned for racing, which meant it needed constant attention and had zero tolerance for abuse. Get the mixture wrong and the engine would seize without warning. The real terror was the suspension. The TA used a race-inspired setup with massive anti-roll bars and ultra-stiff springs. It was perfect for a smooth racetrack, but completely inappropriate for public roads. The car would hop and skip over bumps like a flat stone on water. Hit a pothole, and the car would literally bounce off the ground. The TA's party trick was something called instant lift-off oversteer. The moment you lifted off the throttle in a corner, the rear end would snap around like a whip. There was no gradual breakaway, no warning. 1 second you were cruising, the next you were sliding backwards into a tree. But the most dangerous aspect was the aerodynamics. The TA came with a massive rear spoiler that was designed to keep the car planted at racing speeds. At normal highway speeds, it was worse than useless. The spoiler would create so much drag that the car would become unstable in crosswinds. A slight breeze would send you careening across lanes. Dodge only made the TA for 1 year, claiming homologation requirements had been met. The real reason was that they had created a car so specialized and so dangerous that only professional drivers could handle it safely. 1971 Ford Mustang Boss 351. Ford's Mustang Boss 351 was supposed to be the ultimate street strip machine. It combined the high-revving 351 Cleveland engine with competition-inspired suspension and aerodynamics. What Ford actually created was a car that could run with the best of them, but had a nasty habit of trying to kill its driver. The 351 Cleveland engine was Ford's masterpiece. It made 330 horsepower and revved to 7,000 RPM, which was unheard of for a street car in 1971. The engine was so advanced that it wouldn't be matched until the 1980s. But all that performance came with a price. The engine was tuned so aggressively that it had zero tolerance for anything less than perfect maintenance. The real terror was the handling. Ford had given the Bosch 351 a competition suspension that was designed for professional drivers on closed courses. The car would grip incredibly well right up to the limit, then let go suddenly and violently. There was no gradual breakaway, no warning. 1 second you were hero, the next you were zero. The Boss 351's aerodynamics were another nightmare. The front spoiler would create so much downforce that the car would become unstable at high speeds. Above 100 miles per hour, the rear end would get light, causing the car to wander across lanes. Combined with the aggressive suspension, it was like driving a guided missile with a hair trigger. Ford's engineers had also made the mistake of using ultra-wide tires with a stiff suspension. The result was a car that would transmit every imperfection in the road directly to the driver. But worse, the wide tires would suddenly lose grip when they hit water, oil, or debris. The car would instantly swap ends, sending you spinning into whatever was nearby. Ford only made the Boss 351 for 1 year before discontinuing it. They claimed emissions regulations killed it, but the truth was that they had created a car so violent that even they were afraid of it. 1970. Plymouth Hemi Barracuda. Plymouth's Hemi Barracuda was the ultimate expression of the muscle car era. It combined the legendary 426 Hemi engine with a lightweight body and minimal safety equipment. The result was a car that could run with anything on the planet, but would probably kill you in the attempt. The 426 Hemi engine was a race motor that happened to be street legal. It made 425 horsepower and 490 foot-pounds of torque, which was enough to twist the Barracuda's unibody into a pretzel. The engine was so powerful that Plymouth had to use a special hood with functional air scoops just to keep it from overheating. But keeping it cool was the least of your worries. The real terror was the torque. The Hemi made so much low-end torque that it would overwhelm the chassis from idle. Hard acceleration would cause the entire car to flex like a wet noodle. The doors would jam, the windows would bind, and sometimes the rear window would crack from the body flex. It was like driving a car made of rubber. The Barracuda's suspension was completely inadequate for the Hemi's power. The front end would lift so high under acceleration that you'd lose steering. The rear end would squat so low that the exhaust pipes would scrape the ground. And if you hit a bump while accelerating, the car would literally bounce sideways. But the most dangerous aspect was the weight distribution. The Hemi engine was so heavy that it completely overwhelmed the front suspension. The car would understeer horribly in corners, pushing wide no matter what you did. But lift off the throttle and the rear end would snap around like a whip. Plymouth sold fewer than 700 Hemi Barracudas in 1970, making it one of the rarest muscle cars ever built. The reason for that rarity was simple. The car was so violent that most buyers were smart enough to stay away. Those who weren't smart enough often didn't survive long enough to warn others. 1970 AMC Rebel Machine. American Motors was always the underdog, but in 1970 they went absolutely ballistic. Enter the AMC Rebel Machine, a car that looked like a traffic violation with wheels and drove like it was trying to escape from prison. AMC took their ordinary, forgettable mid-size Rebel and dropped in a 390 cubic inch V8 tuned to within an inch of its life, then painted it in a red, white, and blue color scheme so loud it should have come with earplugs. On paper, the Rebel machine made 340 horsepower, but everyone knew that was a lie. These cars ran low 14 seconds in the quarter mile, quicker than some Hemis, thanks to factory cold air induction and a Holly carb big enough to swallow pigeons. But for all its straight-line speed, AMC forgot to upgrade almost everything else. The Rebel machine suspension was tuned by a committee that apparently met in a bowling alley. The car was nose-heavy, tail-happy, and had the reflexes of a startled rhinoceros. Hard acceleration made the rear end squat so low you risked scraping your license plate off. The front end, meanwhile, would go light, so steering became an act of faith. Hit a corner too fast and you'd find out just how quickly a patriotically painted muscle car could turn sideways. But the real killer was the brakes. AMC equipped the machine with power front discs and rear drums, a combo that sounded good in ads but melted faster than cheese on a hot engine block. Road testers reported fade after just one panic stop, and the car's 3,800-pound curb weight didn't help. Add in factory Goodyear Polyglass tires that had less grip than a politician, and you had a recipe for high-velocity disaster. The machine only lasted 1 year. AMC, never known for subtlety, sold less than 2,400 of them and quickly learned that building a red, white, and blue land missile was good for headlines, but bad for insurance rates and survival. Today, the AMC Rebel machine is a cult classic for those brave enough to risk it. It proved that even the smallest dog in the fight can still bite, and sometimes draw blood. There you have it, auto enthusiasts. These were the 15 most powerful and most dangerous muscle cars of the 1970s. Beautiful machines that could embarrass supercars, but would probably kill you in the process. The 70s proved that sometimes there really is such a thing as too much power. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future updates. And here's another video I've specially selected for you. See you next time.